Hey, hello. Thank you for taking the time to tune in to this week's reflection. I've entitled it Unchained Joy. Have you ever sat still for a quiet moment in the storms of life, your soul rattled, and you kind of wondering how joy could possibly take root in your life? And I'm not talking about a fleeting joy, I'm talking about something deeper. It's in those kinds of moments that Paul's letter to the Philippians really encourages me. I mean, you can imagine Paul, once Saul, this fierce Pharisee, this guy who has the Torah etched into his bones, and it's highly likely he's chained up, in a Roman cell around AD 60. Guards pacing up and down, everything's kind of dangling by a thread, and yet you can picture his quill kind of scratching out the words, rejoice always. You read that and looking at the circumstances, I mean, this is not bravado. This is something else. This is mystery wrapped in covenant promises. As someone drawn to Jesus as the fulfillment of the biblical story, this letter doesn't just instruct, it invites us to linger. It invites us to wrestle, to let its light seep into our lives. I mean, what if the ground beneath our faith isn't just neutral soil, but the same rocky Judean earth that Paul knew? Paul is writing to believers in ancient Philippi. It was a Roman outpost in northern Greece, right? Buzzing with emperor cults, indifferent to the echoes of an ancient faith handed down at Sinai. Paul had already ignited a flame in Philippi on his second journey. We read that in Acts chapter 16. And so there's this blend of synagogue Jews and Gentile seekers drawn to the God of Israel. And his opening line in his letter is saints in Christ Jesus. He calls them saints in Christ Jesus. It's a phrase that's just kind of humming with Exodus level holiness. A set apart people marked by covenant blood. And it's not a pivot from Paul's roots. It's a deepening. I mean, what does it mean to be in Christ without erasing the markers of our heritage? We live in a splintered age. The lines are blurred between tradition and innovation, Jew and grafted in. This letter whispers a profound unity. Paul doesn't prescribe a new religion. He unveils how Jesus mends the divide, inviting all of us to the table without demanding that we forget our seats. In churches today, isolated like Philippi's outpost, it's a call to cherish that tension, not as a fracture between Gentile and Jew, but as fertile ground for growth. Chapter 2 unfolds like a sacred poem, doesn't it? Jesus emptying himself, stepping from equality with God into the dust of a servant, obedient to his death. It's more than just words. It's a mirror to Isaiah 53's prophesied suffering servant, pierced for transgressions, lifted for glory. I mean, we read the words, every knee bowing, and that's an echo of Isaiah 45:23, for all to acknowledge God, now crowned on the one who was despised. And us, when we read this, in the quiet of its truth, it probes. What if our squabbles, those everyday tugs like Judea and Syntyche in chapter 4, verse 2, what if our struggles aren't just petty, but shadows of a deeper exile from oneness, from unity? The invitation from Jesus is to let go of our rights and to be gentle with others. It's the only way to bridge the differences that we might have with other people. And it requires humility. And humility becomes holy ground. It's a place where superiority dissolves and shared servanthood begins. I mean, true worship blooms in the soil of surrender. It's such a great letter. There's 16 mentions of joy or rejoicing in 4 short chapters. And so from his cell, Paul doesn't deny the dark. He reframes it. Joy, he says, isn't chained to circumstances. It's rooted in the presence of Jesus. It's that Psalm 16 verse 11 fullness where the paths of life converge. He writes about rival preachers. Even if they're stirring envy, what does Paul say? He says, rejoice. The threat of execution, to live is Christ, to die is gain. Still, rejoice, because the gospel advances. It's impossible to stop. The Philippians, those faithful partners battered for their Jewish Messiah allegiance, they don't get a reprimand from Paul. They just get this tender encouragement. It's as if when Paul's writing the letter, he pauses. You can imagine his ink-stained hands wiping away tears of love for these people. In our journey, where joy often goes to war with misunderstanding or marginalization, the thought of Paul's love for the Philippians it lands like grace. What trials are you facing? How are you letting joy reshape your soul? In chapter 3, Paul makes this confession, and it kind of hits like a thunderclap, right, in still air. He goes through his pedigree, his 8th-day circumcision, Benjamite zeal, Torah flawlessness, and he flings it aside as skubala, dung in the raw Greek. He puts it aside for the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. It's not anti-Jewish vitriol. It's this heart-rending pivot. All the zeal, that was once aimed at the shadows is now fixed on the light who fulfills the promise of resurrection. Daniel chapter 12, right? And Paul's pressing on in chapter 3, not to earn, but to embody the heavenly call of God. And then we get that iconic, I can do all things through him who strengthens me, in chapter 4, verse 13. It's contentment's creed. It echoes the lesson of daily provision from Exodus 16. It's resurrection power now, conforming us to Christ-likeness, even as we await the fullness. Citizens of heaven, yet exiles here. We read this in chapter 3. Doesn't that duality stir something profound? In 2025's chaos, I think it calls us to stop and reflect. For me, it's a quiet revolution. Faith as pilgrimage, transforming me and my attitude for the age to come when Jesus subdues all. Philippians isn't just a little manual to skim through. It's a companion for the long walk. Paul's unyielding voice, urging us to unity's embrace, humility's depth, joy's resilience, and hope's horizon. In this mosaic of faith where Jesus weaves our stories into this grand biblical tapestry, it poses a tender question. What if unchained joy is less a gift to hoard and more a flame to tend together? May joy find its way through your chains.